Now that you've gotten from your Active Directory design team the requirements for what group policies need to be deployed inside your environment, it's time now to sit down and actually configure those group policies so that we can control and manage and configure the user desktops, whether it be for the individual user themselves or for the computer, so that no matter which user sets down the machine, they get the same environment. So in this session, we'll be looking at how do we deploy software using group policies, and we'll talk a little bit about the differences between the publishing of software and the assigning of software. We'll talk a little bit about doing software updates, and then finish up with how to remove software in the event that it falls out of scope of management. We'll look at how to deploy scripts. In the server environment using group policies, we have startup scripts and shutdown scripts for the computer. We have log on and log off scripts for the user. And we'll see that one of the biggest problems that we have when we're deploying scripts with group policies is where we place the script. If we do not place the script in the appropriate point or the appropriate spot, the script may be applied inconsistently and may not be applied at all. So there's a specific spot those scripts have to be in. And then we'll finally get in and we'll actually look at the group policy management console, and we'll look at some of the things that we can configure in the environment. There's over 4,000 line items when you actually get to Server 2012 in a Windows 8 environment. So there's no way in a session like this that we can cover every single line item. So we'll cover some of the major line items. We'll talk a little bit about folder redirection. We'll talk about some of you may be using Internet Explorer maintenance where you set maybe home pages or you set favorites. I'm going to show you that that's now gone away in the environment. We'll talk a little bit about preferences. We've talked about preferences in other sessions, so it'll be a little bit of a review. So jumping right into deploying software. Well, first of all, the group policy environment can only deploy software that is either has a Microsoft installer package, an MSI, or .zap extension, using something that created the ZAP extension. Most commonly, we'll be using the Microsoft installer packages, or MSIs. And that's all group policy can deploy. Group policy cannot deploy executables. Group policy cannot deploy .coms or .sys files, only .msis. If we want to use an executable, we either have to use some type of tool to convert that MSI or that executable to an MSI, or we have to use some other product to deploy the software. Microsoft's common product would be using the System Center Configuration Manager, or SCCM would be used to deploy. Group policy is not designed to replace a SCCM. Right? It's not designed to do that. The other thing with deploying a group policy, or deploying software through group policy, we can only manage the software group policy deploys. Updates, removals, that types of things. So if the software was deployed through some other mechanism or installed locally, group policy cannot manage it. And so we'll look at with that also. So when we deploy the software, we have to define a couple terms. First of all, we have the ability to deploy software to a computer, or we can deploy software to the user. Right? Either one, because remember, there's two components inside the group policy interface, user and computer. We also can publish the software or assign the software through the group policy interface. If I decide I'm going to deploy the software to the computer, when I go into the interface, the option to publish the software is going to be grayed out. So we cannot deploy the software to the computer if we decide we want to publish. If we assign the software to the computer, it'll be auto install at startup. We deploy software to a computer so that no matter who sets down at that machine, the software will be available to that user. So the user will not have to invoke the installation. So example, a kiosk. So it doesn't matter who sets down that kiosk. If I'm going to deploy software to the user, I have an option to publish it. If I decide to publish the software to the user, right, first of all, it can be installed through add, remove programs. So to show you real quick, right, what I mean by that is if I come into my server here, and I'm just going to use my server as an example, and I bring up my control panel, because it's the same interface for Windows 7 or Server 2000 or Windows 8. If I come into Programs, and I come up here to Programs and Features, and I choose to install a piece of software, actually it's not showing up on here, on the server right here would be, or on the Windows 7 box and the Windows 8 box would be an option right here to deploy the software via the network. And any software that I've deployed to the user will now show up in this little area right here on the network. Keep in mind in Windows XP, right, you actually had an area you would click on and said, show me the network installations. And again, it would show me only the software that's being installed through the network. All right, I want to uninstall anyway. Let's go back in here. Programs and Features. All right, it's not showing up. Okay, so that's where it would show up on a Win 7 or a Win 8 box. If I, also along the same line items, if I decide I want to deploy the software to the user, there's this thing called document invocation. Right? Really, really fancy word, invocation. What does that really mean? When I deploy the software inside the Group Policy Management Console, inside the interface, I have an option to associate extensions of files with a specific piece of software that's being deployed through the Group Policy or through Group Policies. So now what happens is, if the software has been deployed to the user has never done anything to cause that software to be installed on the machine before, when the user goes into the Windows Explorer or they go into My Computer and they browse to the file and they double click on the file to open it, instead of getting a box that pops up that says, what do you want to use to open this file if it's not been installed, a box will pop up at the bottom of the screen that says installing managed app, and the application will start the installation. And I'm going to give myself a little bit more room over here, and I'm going to put invocation down here. So that's the way the software is deployed, right, if I decide to publish. If I decide to assign the software, right, add reprogram still works, document invocation still works. But what we also add is it's advertised. It actually will show up in the user start menu. And if I'm running something like Windows 8 that has the tiles, right, it'll show up in the tile menu. And then the first time the user clicks on that tile, it will invoke the installation of the application that's been deployed through Group Policies. And then again, across the bottom of the screen, it'll say installing managed app. If I have assigned the software, here's the cool thing. It's resilient. If the application becomes corrupted or broken in some mechanism, Group Policies will self-heal the application as long as the application is still deployed. And then finally, a new feature that Microsoft added in Windows Server 2003, it's deselected by default, so you actually have to select this. Auto install at logon. Right? So when the user logs on, the application is automatically installed. They don't have to do anything to invoke the installation. So when I decide I want to deploy the software, or when the Active Directory design team or an Active Directory applications team, someone came out and told you we need to deploy the software, they're going to basically tell us whether we're assigning the software, whether we're publishing the software, and whether or not the software is being published or assigned to the user and or computer. The other thing about software deployment, and this is kind of interesting and kind of fun, if you've ever woken up in the middle of the night and you left your TV on, and there's one of those infomercials on TV, right? Like Ronco Peele, and he's got up there his little rotisserie machine with the set it and forget it commercial, one of my favorite commercials, right? And I use that term a lot in class. You set it and you forget it. Active Directory deployment of Group Policies is kind of the same way. And here's my infomercial of how software deployment works. When the user invokes the installation of the software, the Windows Installer Service, powered by Intellimere Technologies, logs on as a background service with heightened privileges. It installs the application, then logs itself back off. So the user no longer requires administrative rights or heightened privileges to install the applications. It's actually the Windows Installer Service that's going to install the application. Keep that in mind when it comes to troubleshooting. The Windows Installer Service. The Windows Installer Service. There is a group policy option, both for the computer side and at the user side, that we can actually go in and disable the Windows Installer Service so that applications don't get installed, which means that MSI can't be installed. And if you go in and you disable the Windows Installer Service, group policies can't deploy software because that service isn't available. So you want to keep that in mind. So to look at how do we actually deploy software, I'm going to go into my domain controller here. And I'll bring up the Group Policy Management Console. And what I've done is I've already created the distribution point. And one of the things you need to be aware of is you need to create a folder out on the network. That folder needs to be shared with the appropriate permissions and share permissions and NTFS permissions so that when we go to deploy that software, that the user that requires the software has the appropriate permissions that at least read the folder the software is in. We have to make sure we set up that distribution point, and we need to set it up prior to trying to deploy the software. So I'm going to come into my Active Directory environment here. I've already configured a distribution point. So I'll come down under Arizona, I'll come down under Design, and I'm just going to leave it here at the Design OU for my demo. Or actually, I'll come down to Group Policy Objects. I'm going to secondary click, New, and I'm just going to call this Demo Software Deployment. And hit OK. Right? So this just created a demo Group Policy Object. I'll come in and I'll edit it. Now when I come into Edit, and if I come into Policies, notice I've got Software Settings under the computer, and if I come in under User, I have Software Settings under the user. If I secondary click on software installation, whether it be on the user or the computer, it doesn't matter which one, I'm actually setting on the machine's properties, right, some things that are going to be the default settings when I go to deploy software. So if I have a default distribution point, I can actually put what that path is here. So now when I go to deploy the software, that's where it's going to search automatically. I can choose whether the deployment's always going to be a publish or an assign. In this case, because I'm up under the computer section, my only option is the assign. I have an advanced area here for setting up whether or not the application is going to be uninstalled when the computer or user falls out of the scope of management. In other words, I move the user or computer to a different OU structure. The computer gets removed from the domain. How am I going to support 64-bit with the Windows on Windows environment? Over here under the categories, I know of an organization that deployed over 300 applications using group policies. And what they did was they put them in categories. They created categories based off departments. They also created categories based off the type of application, word processing, graphic designs, spreadsheets, that type of thing. And then when they deployed the software, they can actually put the software in a specific category. So that now when the user comes in, they browse, they install the software, they go into the control panel, they can actually go and say, only show me the software that was deployed for the design team, for instance. And then once I have created an installation package, I can now then come in under file extensions and associate a specific dot something with a specific piece of software. So when the user invokes the installation through that document invocation. If I secondary click under the computer and I do new package, notice that it defaults to the local machine for the package. Right? We always want to browse the network, because if you do this and you choose the package and you choose the software, right, what's going to happen is the software is not going to install. Right? As a result, when the user goes to try to install it, because it's not on the local drive, it won't have it there. So what we need to do is we need to browse out to the corporate network. Right? And I have a packages folder that's already been shared. The permissions have been set up, and so here I come out to here's the package. If I double click on this package, and this is just a little bitty application that does a little bit of networking testing stuff, but it's just an MSI. So I'm not really worried about what this app does. This is more for demonstration purposes to show you what the package is. If I double click on here, right, notice my only option is the sign. I can't publish. I can't publish because of the fact that I'm using deploying to the computer. So I'll go ahead and cancel this, and I'll come down to the user section, and I'll go out to the exact same package. Notice it's out to the server. If I double click on it, notice I have an option to publish or assign. Yeah. If I check assign and I hit OK, right, I've now deployed this package. If I secondary click on this and come down to properties, these tabs that are going across the top are the exact same tabs I would have gotten if I would have selected the radio button for advanced. If I come in under deployment, this is where I can modify how the deployment is going to be. This is where I can also change it from an assigned package to a published packaged. And here is the checkbox I was talking about if I want to auto install it at logon. I can also have it not displayed in the admin programs. I can also have it uninstall when the app falls out of management, scope of management. If I've set that up as a default to uninstall, right, I can actually come in here and remove the checkbox. If the software has been deployed and now it's been 6 months, a year has gone by, and I want to upgrade the software package, right, I would deploy a new package, but I'd use the upgrade tab. And then I could browse and add. I choose what package I want to upgrade, and then I choose whether or not the package is uninstalled before the upgrade goes on, or install with the software over. That's knowing the actual product itself. And then this is where I choose whether or not it's a mandatory upgrade or not. If I do not make it a mandatory upgrade, the users will continue to use the pre-upgraded version, and then will actually go into the control panel, or if it's assigned, into the advertisement to upgrade it. This is where I can choose what category to list it in if I created the categories out under the software installation properties. Then finally, this thing called modifications. Right? When I deploy software, a lot of times it requires user intervention. The key for the software, maybe there is preferences for the folder I want to install it into. There may be component preferences for installation. Well, if that software requires all of that, when the user goes to invoke the installation, now they have to know the CD key. They have to know what components they want installed. They have to know what the directory structures they want installed in. Well, we can actually create what's called a .mst, a transformer file. And what this .mst allows me to do, if there's one created and it's located in the distribution point, it'll show up here with the option to add, and I can add that MST to this package. So now what happens is when that user goes to deploy the software, it reads the .mst, and then it configures the software for deployment. What's cool here is I can list multiple .msts in this software deployment point, and then have different departments using different MSTs. So my design team might get one installation of the software, my marketing team might get something different, my accounting team might get different components. So it allows me to customize that software deployment without actually going out to the machines themselves through here. If you're deploying Office, it's actually a .msp instead of a .mst. So my software is now deployed. Right? That's the simple software deployment. Right? And I showed you how to upgrade the software. If I wanted to do a selective upgrade, I would create a new package, and then when I do the new package, I might create a new group policy object. And then on that group policy object, I could then put in a filter, using a security filter and saying, all right, I only want this upgrade to go to managers. And then I would create a software or a group policy filter so only managers would read that. That would be how I do a selective. And then finally, I want to do an uninstall. If I secondary click on here, right, I have an option here to all tasks remove. What this will allow me to do when I choose removal is I can either do a mandatory removal or an optional removal. And what the mandatory removal does is it'll go out, and everywhere this group policy object had deployed the software, it's going to remove the software. If I choose an optional removal, what will happen is now when the users continue to use their application, and they actually have to go to the add remove programs and actually uninstall the application itself. Here's an issue with this though. If I go back to this drawing from a few seconds ago, right? Notice this resilient option right here, right? If I have assigned the software to the user and I've done an optional removal, when the user goes to remove the software, it'll be removed, but it's no longer resilient. So if the software becomes corrupted or broken, right, it won't be self-healing anymore. You need to keep that in mind, not self-healing anymore. Okay? So that's deploying software with the group policy object. So let's talk about scripts. Right? When I deploy scripts, right, in the environment, first of all, right, when I browse on my domain controller, if I browse my Windows directory, I have a directory called sysvol. Inside the sysvol directory, I've got another folder called sysvol. Then I have my domain, and then I have a folder called scripts. Ladies and gentlemen, scripts do not go in the scripts folder. If I'm doing log on, log off, startup, or shutdown scripts, they do not get placed in the scripts folder. And you're going to yourself, Rick, say it's not so. Well, I'm sorry, it's so. If I am doing NT4O based scripting and I go in, I have the option to create the logon scripts in a user's properties sheet in Active Directory, that's where I place scripts. But if I'm doing scripts for group policy, I don't put scripts here. So if your scripts are running inconsistently, they're there sometimes they're not, or they're not running at all, chances are whoever deployed the script probably put the script in the scripts folder. The script has to go in the appropriate group policy template. Now, notice I currently have 6 group policy objects. The default domain policy, the default domain controller policy, the demo software deployment policy I just created, plus 3 other policies in the environment. Right? Which one of these folders, that based off of a GUID, do I go to put the script in? It's kind of like Russian roulette. I don't know. So here's what's nice. In the Active Directory environment, inside group policies, Microsoft has made it easier for us to do scripts. So I'm just going to stay within this environment where I am. I come in my Windows settings. I've got startup scripts and shutdown scripts under the computer. If I go under the user, I got log on and log off scripts. So I'm going to go into my Windows Explorer here for a minute. And I have a logon script here called design logon. So I'm going to secondary click on this and I'm going to copy. So it's in my clipboard. Right. Now I'm going to come down and I'm going to do it as a logon script because that was its name. I go logon scripts. I come over where it says logon. Notice it says, right, contains user logon scripts. I double click this and it opens up a property sheet. In this interface, I want to add the script to the appropriate group policy template. So I do show files. What this just did is it just went into my Windows, sysvol folder, domain, policies, the appropriate GUID, user, scripts, logon folder. Whew, that's a mouthful. Then I paste the script into that folder. All that did is paste the script into the appropriate directory structure. It still has not linked the script to the actual group policy object. I then close this folder. I'm back to this screen. I then can click Add. Browse. It browses me right back to the exact same folder again. I now double click on the script. If there's any script parameters I want to add, I can add them. I click OK. This script has now been placed in the appropriate group policy template for the appropriate group policy in the appropriate scripts folder, right? And now when I hit OK, this script is now linked to this group policy object. So the next time a user logs on in the OU structure that this group policy object has been assigned to, now has the appropriate script. One thing I want to point out about this screen is if I have multiple scripts in this screen, scripts in this screen are read, not bottom up, Scripts in the screen are read top down. So if there were a second script in here, it would not run until the first script was done. Right? Keeping that in mind. Keeping that in mind. Starting in Server 2008 R2, right, Microsoft now gives us the ability to also deploy PowerShell scripts. But here's the gotcha about a PowerShell script. In order to deploy a PowerShell script, PowerShell must be on the machines that this script is going to run on, because the .ps1 extension. So if I'm deploying this to a Windows XP box, or Windows 2000 or 2003 box, or even a Vista box, ooh, that was a bad word, sorry about that, a Vista box, if I have not gone in and installed PowerShell v2 on those machines, the .ps1 will not run, especially, and the reason why I said at least PowerShell v2, because if your script has v2 callouts in it, it needs to be v2. If you don't have any v2 callouts in it, you can do v1, but I recommend at the minimum v2. Right? Notice it says the minimum is Windows 7 and Windows 2008 R2 because PowerShell v2 is installed on the boxes by default. Right? So scripts, right? That's where we put scripts. Now the fun begins. Right? Inside the Group Policy Management Console, I'm going to stay in here. Right? And I'm going to come down under the computer for a little bit and spend just a few minutes under the computer under Administrative Templates. Some of the things that are in here under Administrative Templates that I can control. And I need to keep this in mind. There's over 4,000 line items in here. Right? Ladies and gentlemen, there's no way I can go through all those 4,000 line items. Right? I'd be hearing here in the classroom, I'd be hearing the heads, the instructor's worst nightmare. And for those of you that watch this through video, right, you're liable to knock your monitor over or knock your coffee over or something, and that would be a bad thing. So we're going to cover some of the highlights in here. So under Administrative Templates for the computer, if I come into my control panel, notice I can control things like personalization in here. I also can control, and I think this is kind of funny, you know that default user account picture that pops up for users? Right? This allows me to set what I want that picture to look like. And notice over here in the write-up, it tells you, right, where the picture has to be located at on the local machine. So I can use a Microsoft preference to actually point, or a group policy preference, to put the picture there, and then I can call it out. Here at this organization, when this first came out, I wanted to play with it. So in the group policy environment here, I made the default picture a pet rock. And every one of my users here got pet rocks for the pictures for the longest time, and no one ever figured it out and caught on. Right? But that's where you can set a picture. If I come in under the networking component, right, there's actually quite a bit of stuff in here to configure, but a couple things I want to point out here that you need to see is, first of all, under DNS, right, there's a lot of configuration that we can through DHCP with DNS. The exact same settings can also be configured here for DNS. So if you've configured them through DHCP and you've configured them here, let's think about this for a second. Who's going to win? Who was applied last? DHCP or here? And if you're saying to yourself, here, you're absolutely right. DHCP got applied when the computer started up. So if you're having issues with things like DNS suffixes or DNS search lists or timeout values or don't seem to be right, check group policies to make sure someone hasn't made a setting here. I go on down under network connections. Right? One of the biggies here is, you see this thing here called Windows Firewall, and you got domain profile and standard profile. Right? These is where well, that's good use of the English language. This is where I set, right, group policies to control Windows XP Service Pack 2 and Windows 2003 firewall settings, not Windows Vista or later. Windows Vista or later firewall settings are all configured under Windows settings, security settings, Windows firewall with advanced security settings. This is where I configure firewall settings if I'm running Vista or later operating systems. Going on down, some of the other things that are in here is I can control how the machines themselves are going to allow or disallow offline files. Offline files are also configured under the user component. I have an option here to configure some TCP/IP settings, and these are some parameters that can be set, and specifically how I can configure, and you may have heard these terms before, IPv4 to v6 transition technologies. This is where I configure my Torado settings, my ISATAP settings. It's also where I can configure my 6-to-4 settings. So some things to think about where I can configure them. Going on down under printers. One of the things that Microsoft made a change of in Windows Server 2008 R2 was, by default now, when you share a printer on a computer connected to your domain, that printer is no longer auto-published in Active Directory. They used to be. They changed that back. In here is where I can come in and say whether or not I want the printers to be auto-published. And it's in here. Also, whether or not we want to do the what's called pre-population printers. So when a user browses Active Directory, they only see the printers that are in their network segment. If you are, and here's the auto-publish here. If I come down, actually, and then allow pruning of printers, what pruning of printers does is, by default, once every 8 hours, Active Directory goes out and it looks at every printer object that's been published in the Active Directory environment and goes out and queries the printer to find out the printer's still there. Well, if I've gone in on manually configured printers in here, that manually configured printer doesn't understand how to respond to this request. So what will happen is those printers may get automatically pruned out of Active Directory. So this is where I can go in and turn off auto pruning. Auto pruning is on by default. If I come on down some of the other settings under system, some of the biggies in here and some of the things that are cool, under device installation and driver installation, these kind of work hand in hand. What device installation allows me to do under device installation requirements is, one of the things we used to do in the past was, I was concerned if a user brought in a USB thumb drive and I had a sensitive machine, if they put that USB thumb drive in the machine, they could capture information. But the problem was I couldn't turn off the USB ports because a USB mouse and USB keyboard required those ports. Well, now in the environment, and this has been around since Vista, and it got better in Windows 7 and Server 2008 R2, is I now can create either a whitelist or a blacklist of USB devices that I want to allow into my corporate network. And when I create that whitelist or blacklist, let's now come in, here's installation of device drivers that meets these. I have to know what's called the device class. Right? The device class is a GUID or an identifier of that specific device. Some of the device classes will be listed in the device manager. Some of the device classes will have to Google or Bing on. Some of the device classes will have to go to the vendor and find out what the device class is. So I can go in and I can actually disable USB thumb drives or disable USB removable media as an example. Or maybe I want to disable USB Bluetooth device as an example. Coming on down, right? We'll talk more about, we talked about group policy in a previous session. I can control shutdown options. I can control system restore points. I can control how scripts are running in the environment, all for the computer. If I come down under Windows components, right, some of the major things I can do here. This is where I can turn on or turn off the Windows installer service. I can configure BitLocker encryption here, whether or not BitLocker is on or off, whether I'm going to allow them to do BitLocker, not allow them to do BitLocker, whether I want to store the BitLocker recovery key in Active Directory. Coming on down, I can event viewer settings, whether I'm going to allow them to run the .asp extensions. Internet Explorer settings, everything that I can control about Internet Explorer through the menu system can all be controlled through here. So it gets pushed out to everybody in the environment. And then every individual component inside Microsoft, I either can allow or disallow them to run in. Things like Calendar, Defender configuration, Windows Installer, logon options, Windows Mail, all right? Everything. You can see the list here of whether you're going to allow them or disallow them. Then finally, if I'm using something like Windows Software Update Services or Windows Update Services, WSUS or WS, right? This allows me to come in and configure, right, whether or not they're going out to the Microsoft site to get them or we're coming to an in-house site. That's all for the computer. Then if I come down under the user, right? One of the things I want to point out here under Windows settings for the user, notice Internet Explorer maintenance is gone. If you're familiar with this environment with Windows 2000 or 2003 or 2008, you used to have the ability under Windows Explorer maintenance to configure things like proxy settings, configure things like favorites and URLs and all that stuff. Microsoft is now taking that out of group policies with Server 2012 and on Windows 8. Now they want you to configure that using the Microsoft Internet Explorer Administration Kit, or the IEAK. That's where you would configure those types of settings now. Under folder redirection, right? This allows me to identify where I want users to go when they click on something like My Documents or Documents. Instead of hitting their local C drive, it'll redirect them to a network share instead of using something like roaming profiles. Notice all the folders that I can redirect. I can redirect their start menu, so no matter what machine they go to, right, they get the same start menu. Most organizations are going to redirect things like documents, right, so that when they go, if they use different machines, when they click on documents, they see their documents no matter where they go, instead of being on the local machine. Some of these are for, I think, user-friendlier environments, kindler environments, things like music, pictures, videos, and my favorite one, right? If you're someone like some of the people that I work with, like John and Adam, right, who are diehard gamers, and they move from one machine to another machine, right? It's very important for them that their game follows them. So that if they get to level 48 on this machine, when they go to the next machine, they want to make sure they're at level 48 instead of level 1 all over again. I can have it follow their games along. Woohoo! Yeah, really. Seriously? But it's there. I can have downloads follow them, right? But here's the problem. What if the user is a laptop user? And they go to a different location, or they go home, they go on the road, they turn on the machine. They don't have access to the corporate network. As a result, anything you've redirected won't be available to them. So now you get that phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning because someone's got insomnia, and they logged onto their laptop and they went, my documents are missing. No, your documents aren't missing. You need to be connected to the corporate network. Now, if they VPN, they can actually get connected to their network share, but it's something to think about. This might be where you want to think about using, I'm going to use a really, really bad word for some of you guys and gals, so I know some of you guys are going to cringe when I say this. You might want to use offline files. But if you decide you want to use offline files, you need to make sure you teach your users the consequences of using offline files, for instance, My Documents, so they don't have to do it. The other thing that you need to decide when you're setting up this folder redirection is, right, you need to create a network share. So when you go in to set up folder redirection, I'll just use Documents as an example, right? When I go in and configure this, right, I need to know the path, right, to where the share is. And then when I set up the share under settings, it's going to ask you, does this user get exclusive permissions to this folder? In other words, right, are they the only one that can see it? If not, other people can access it. So you need to think about security issues when you set this up, right? So just some things to think about. You also, when you set this up, there's an option. Do you move what's currently in the folder to the network share? Going on down under the user component of administrative templates. A lot of the stuff that we saw up for the computer is also available for the user. Under the control panel, right? I can have things like, I can control what the admin programs looks like, or I can control whether or not they can actually gain access to the control panel here. One of the things that you may see if you're on an XP box, if you go to display, this is where all your screensaver information is. In Vista, they moved it to personalization, so it's now under personalized. I can choose their screensaver. I can choose under the desktop. I can set whether or not they can add things to the desktop, remove things on the desktop, move things on the desktop. And yes, I can even set what their wallpaper is on the desktop. Under network, some of the same things I can configure up the top, I can configure now with the network connections. Think about this. You want a nightmare on your hands in troubleshooting, right? settings get set when the user logs onto a machine. Someone else logs onto them, they don't see it. This is where I configure the user side for offline files. Going on down, start menu. I can control every facet of a user's start menu. What they can and cannot see, what they can and cannot do, can be controlled through the start menu. Simple things like removing search, removing run, adding run, removing favorites, adding favorites. Every single facet of what I can do on the start menu, I can do here. Under system, some of the biggies in here. This is where I would go if I wanted to remove the user's ability to run registry editing tools, or I want to remove their ability to run the command prompt. I want to remove their ability to run is back under start menu. So command prompt and run are two separate things. But there's two things I want to point out that are very, very, very big misconceptions. Notice there's a thing called prevent or don't run specific Windows apps or run specific Windows apps. You have to know what the Windows app is. So if you wanted to block or allow someone to run Calculator, you can list run only specific apps. And if you only put Calculator in it, they try to run Windows or Internet Explorer, they try to run Paint, they try to run anything, it would not run. But here's the gotcha. Notice what it says. Windows apps, not Microsoft apps, Windows apps. So it's got to be an application that's part of the base operating system in order for me to either allow or block it through this interface. If I want to block or allow other applications, I want to use something like AppLocker or the software restrictions policies. Other things, I can, driver installation, right? Down here, I've also under system got the ability to control group policies for the user side. I've got logon environments down here. If I'm having a problem with scripts running and they don't appear to be running correctly, all right, this is where I can run scripts. Down here, control scripts. User profiles, right? One of my favorites. My documents, my video, my music, my pictures, favorites, all that's part of a user's profile, which means that profile grows and grows and grows and grows. If I want to control the size of the user's profile, this is where I can set the profile limit and actually say, right, how much space they can use. And look at what the default is, folks, right? 3,000 megabytes. In other words, 3 gig is the max of their profile by default. Can you imagine that if you're using roaming profiles, 3 gig up and down off the network, every time the user logs on and logs off? Good use of profiles. Then finally down here, under Windows Components, right? Almost everything that was up under the computer portion is down here also under the user portion. I can control backup from the user side. I have the gadgets. I also have Windows Explorer, right? I can control Windows Explorer, whether or not they have previous versions, disable previous versions. I can hide drives. I can prevent access to drives. If they have a burner in their machine, I can disable their ability to use the burner, even through things like Windows Media Player or some other application. It actually disables the burning feature on the drive. Going on down, right? The same thing that we had up at the top, right? Everything we had at the top is also down here at the bottom for whether or not, on a user side, whether I want to block things like Calendar or Windows Media Player or Windows Mail or Messenger can all be configured down here. And I also have Windows Update down here as a user. And something I didn't point at the top, I also, if I don't want to come in here and find something, I also have all settings that lists every single setting under the user. If I don't know under which node of the Group Policy Management Console to go to, I can go to that individual setting. The other thing I want to point out about the Group Policy Interface and Administrative Templates is this little bitty thing here. It looks like a golf tee. If I click on that, notice I get a golf tee now, shows up on all my administrative templates. Let's say, for instance, I only wanted to find those administrative line items that deal with startup. I can secondary click on administrative templates to filter options, and I can put in a keyword called startup. And then hit OK. And what happens is, notice the list got really, really shorter. And I'm now only going to see those line items that actually either have the word startup inside the actual policy name, or it's in the description of a policy. So this allows me to shrink that 4,000 plus list down to something that might be a little bit manageable that we're looking for. And then if I come into all settings, right, it only shows you things that show startup. And what I like about all settings, if I come over here, it actually shows me where in the path I can find it. So what did we look at in this session, right? We've looked at, right, how do we deploy software using group policies and what are some of the deployment features? We looked at how to configure scripts and the pitfalls of putting scripts in the wrong place. We also looked at some of the settings we can use when we deploy user desktops or we want to configure user desktops. I know we went through some of those line items quickly, but even if I spent the next 3, 4, 5 hours going through every one of those line items, next week when you go to look for that line item, you're like, okay, where did Rick say that was? Right? And I still find myself doing it now, and I get on this interface a couple times every single week based on the different classes I'm in. Right? It's just a matter of getting in there and finding things and looking around, and you'll see there's tons of things in there you can do. There's some stuff in there that can get you into trouble if you're not careful. There's stuff in there that can make your lives much, much, much simpler.